far out across the galaxy of Imperial territory on the eastern rim, on the very edge of recorded Imperial worlds, lay a system around a binary star designated as XCV-103. The Imperium dispatched Chief Orbologist Luteus Vox to head an expeditionary team to investigate the singular world orbiting the star, which was seemingly devoid of life. It was titled Angelus. Contact was lost with the expedition soon after, and they subsequently disappeared. Only initial preliminary reports had been received before astropathic contact was lost and then no longer possible. The warp had closed off the ability to reach the planet amid warp disturbances. No detailed record was maintained as no full picture was available regarding the status of the exploratory team. The team itself is entered by Imperial administrators as contact lost and status unknown. The planet was regarded as dead. What became of the exploratory force and what they stumbled upon was a bizarre tale of Xenos species embedding themselves upon Angelus. What happened to the human explorators was even more strange, for as they would eventually discover, the world was, in some respects, far from being fully dead, and soon enough its uninhabited wastelands would, once again, become considerably more active. The planet known as XCV-103 before the Imperium designated it as Angelus was regarded in the early period of the Imperium as a dead world with little signs of life ever having existed there. It was a barren rock, but did display some strange signs of structure on its surface. Luteus Vox and his team crewed the ship Eternal Vigilance, which has been sent to XCV-103 to perform archaeological surveys upon the world. This is fairly standard for the Imperium, and specifically the Adeptus Mechanicus, as they are always searching for lost archaeotech and potentially STCs. Sometimes these are discovered upon worlds which appear dead and barren, but below the surface are often technological complexes from the Dark Age of technology which deliver huge rewards. Though it seems worthwhile to note that at this specific moment in human history, when these explorators arrived upon this world, the Imperium was in the midst of the Nova Terra Internum. This was a fractured period where divisions were appearing among the Mechanicus and several Imperial sectors in the western reaches of Imperial Galactic territory, so close attention was likely not going to be paid to a small exploratory team who had been voyaging for some time to reach this most eastern rim of the galaxy. Initial logs from orbit describe strange energy patterns being read upon the world, comprising waves and fluctuations of energy spikes. It is speculated that it could represent some kind of beacon. This is tracked to an area containing what are believed to be Xenos structures on the surface of the world. Upon this discovery, additional Archaeo-Explorator teams are requested, and the estimated time of arrival for them to the world is 4 months. The Imperials continue expanding their searches on the surface, scanning for both Xenos structures, unusual mineral deposits, or other signs of life. None are immediately forthcoming. More strangely, they discover that the planet itself does not appear to contain any bacteria, viruses, or other nano-organisms. The planet seems to have at some point suffered a complete and total extinction of life, described by the Imperials as being artificial in nature. They also record extremely low presence of water, and as they continue to process their data, explorators find there is little sign of thermonuclear irradiation of the world, ruling out devastating wars of the past or other catastrophic events. The atmosphere is strangely noted to be also deteriorating, and no natural cause is immediately attributable. Water density also continues to drop, but they can find no direct correlation to the planet's situation and its natural aridity. After further assessments of planetary erosion and the detected signs of whatever life had once existed on the planet, the exploratory team conclude the planet to have been dead since the Dark Age of technology, or even before this time. Luteus Vox notes how he is particularly concerned by the seemingly artificial nature by which the planet appears to have been exterminated, describing how, "I have never encountered a planet so devoid of life as this, without any unnatural cause to attribute for it." The investigator teams are now concentrated toward the site designated as Xenos structures. The Imperials have noted energy levels appear to have been surging since their arrival. They cannot make any more detailed assessments, however, based on the information available, but they note that the energy waveforms are of an unknown type and their increasing scale is concerning. These energy signatures are tracked to a position several miles below the surface, and low-level surface scans fail to find any more information of structures or former habitation. However, secondary energy sources are logged across hundreds of other areas. The structures being pyramidal in design are scanned, but their elements are unknown and deny the investigators any further detailed assessment. The explorators believe the coming RKO team may be more successful in determining the nature of these materials and structures. Chief Luteus Vox notes how the planet is contradictory in nature, a dead world, yet clearly having been occupied at some point. It seems devoid of life, but active energy signatures are found, and Vox requests further scanning teams and detailed RKO analysis teams to scour this planet to determine just exactly what is going on here, but reiterates that the eradication of life cannot be attributed to a specific cause. He notes this bears troubling similarity to other worlds in the region. When the additional RKO exploration teams arrive, a base station for the Imperials is established on Angelus. This will enable them to continue to carry out their explorations in a more substantial fashion. The team is headed by Site Director Saul Magellan, who quickly confirms that these structures are indeed Xenos in nature, but the material itself seems impervious to all scans and even psychic probing. To our knowledge, of course, it's quite obvious that this material is blackstone. The RKO teams begin dig sites around the structures and below the surface to try and unearth more information. They note that 3 pyramidal structures appear to potentially have some relationship to star positioning, although this is noted with skepticism. The most interesting structure is what appears to be another pyramid some 10 kilometers from the others, but which appears damaged or dismantled or unfinished perhaps. Saul Magellan notes that he will lead an expedition to this newly discovered structure and to follow on with further details soon. The last details from the Explorator team come in the form of a recovered fragment of a journal entry describing the activities of the Paleologos on Angelus. Its final description is indicative that it was the Imperial explorators, in their ignorance of the Xenos tomb complexes, who may have triggered what was to come next, and be the doom of them all. This journal entry describes how an explorator, Torsen, had led a team into one of the pyramid's antechambers, from which a sarcophagus had been removed already by explorators Gorman and Adler. The internal conditions are described as challenging, with significant debris and sand blocking their filters and other breathing apparatus. More extraction teams are ordered to assist. Torsen progresses into the tomb further using a guide rope that has been set to allow the explorators to find their way through the darkness and the atmosphere, thick with dust. He observes how the walls are covered with glyphs of an unknown origin, and he describes the conditions in the antechamber as having improved, and now he is able to see even more of these glyphs covering the entire surface of the chamber, geometrically arranged rows of script forming intricate patterns, and Torsen notes they are of indescribable beauty. It seems that from this, he is able to identify the builders, as Torsen now names the species as the Necron tier, and that he feels a strange bond of closeness, as if he were being called across the gulf of tens of millions of years. The entry ends here. No further communication to the Imperium is sent. Now, it's anyone's guess as to whether the activities of the Imperial explorators were linked with what was to come next, or if it were a bizarre event of no relation that occurred by chance, for the warp is an inexplicable realm where ships can be chewed up and spat out, for this is exactly what is told to have then happened upon Angelus. Space hulks are not merely derelict ships, they are vast structures floating through the void of the warp, and often they are a mixture of other ships, even sometimes masses of rock, asteroid or planetoid. They're a conglomeration of things all compacted together by huge collisions in the warp and or material space. They form miles of twisted craft and mazes of corridors, potentially even hundreds of miles dependent on the size of the structure formed. For some space hulks originate from the Dark Age of technology or even before this time. Some space hulks are in fact whole fleets of ships who have been crushed into a singular mass by the tempest of the Immaterium and have steadily accumulated other ships thrown together over centuries or millennia. For as we know, time in the warp is not measurable comparative to real space, so these hulks can drift on the seas of warp energy for theoretically millennia by our standards, before they drift into a weak point between the warp and real space where the dimensions converge, and then without warning, a space hulk can drift or be expelled into the Materium. When this occurs, Imperial forces may attempt to search a hulk, as it may contain lost archaeotech, potentially even STC fragments, or other species like Tyranids will often seed hulks with their aggressive Xenos strain, the Gene Stealers, with the aim of them potentially serving as launching points or scouts for hive fleets. The other Xenos, of course, to use space hulks are the ORKS, who will use hulks to transport themselves across the vast spaces between regions of the galaxy. Ork mechs will deliberately create tractor beam generators, often the size of small towns on a planet, and they will use this to trap a space hulk in real space to then allow orks enough time to get aboard via conventional rockets or teleporting tech that the orks call teleporters. The Ork mechs will then create an energy bubble in part of the space hulk so the orks can safely remain within, as often space hulks are extremely unstable, not to mention of course the far more serious threat of entering the warp, but also against the void of space. Finally, the Ork mechs will reverse their tractor beam devices to give the space hulk a kick back into the warp. They will often then build further energy bubble generators on board the hulk to expand their workable area, as there is never a scrap shortage on a space hulk, and eventually they may even be able to construct engines and tools to allow them to steer the hulk in a very crude fashion. Often though, they will say that it is the will of Gork and Mork where they end up. And for the world of Angelus, the Ork gods had seemingly determined that this is where the orks would be deposited. For around the time that the Imperials were making their early assessment that the planet of Angelus held a Necron tomb below its surface, without any warning, a huge rip in real space would appear, and out from this would be expelled a colossal space hulk, which came barreling toward the planet, and more importantly, directly toward the Eternal Vigilance, which ironically was clearly not being especially vigilant, for they were unable to avoid the oncoming mass. This huge warp disturbance immediately severed all communications between the Imperials and long-range astropaths, and this would remain the case for some time. The space hulk itself was dragged out of the warp, it's said, by gravimetric forces, and as it entered the planet's atmosphere. The specifics of just what came first, some kind of gigantic blast from the planet, or the hulk smashing into the planet, are unknown and now likely never will be. Did the human explorators unintentionally trigger an ancient Necron device, or was this a mere chance of fate? Unknown. But what seems sure is that the hulk which tore free from the warp itself was pulled to the planet by the forces which had been scanned by Imperial explorators, and this hulk on its collision path with Angelus smashed straight into the Imperial ships orbiting the world. Eternal Vigilance was now no longer vigilant nor eternal, as the entire mass of space wreckage would plough straight into the surface of the planet, much of it vaporizing on impact, and anything else scattering widely across the surface. It was believed that all Imperials aboard those orbiting ships to have perished, as one might imagine, from having a space hulk ram them straight into the surface of a world. Likely nothing was believed to have remained of those ships. The hulk itself was said to have been burned off to a degree through its severe angle of descent, but then the vaporization of impact, as well as it striking roughly upon the equatorial line of the planet, would cause it to carve into the planet a gigantic scar which extended for something like 1,000 miles. The hulk distributed whatever materials remained all across this huge planetary scar, and wider afield as well, not to mention other materials which broke off in orbit and some which would burn up, others raining down periodically for centuries. Dust and radiation would heavily contaminate the atmosphere of Angelus for as long as a full decade. Despite the extreme impact of the ship annihilating all Imperial forces in orbit, there had been a significant base camp set up upon the world itself, and seemingly at the point at which the hulk impacted Angelus, a reasonable amount of the personnel on the surface were investigating the Necron ruins below. How much time they had to react to what clearly would have been a very obvious visual event is unknown. It's possible that only a few of the explorator team on the surface made it underground, or they may have made it with a good percentage of their forces, including who can know what supplies, tools and provisions. Yet for whatever force had managed to reach the safety of the tombs below the surface, they were now completely isolated, being buried here, and the coming years would only bury them further below decades of settling dust and vast storms which blew huge deserts of sand and material across the site of the explorators. These events took place during M35, and now the only accounts of what came next is told from the descendants of those survivors, now in the period of M41, thousands of years later. In what is referred to as the period of darkness, the bizarre descendants of the Imperial explorators describe to us how they have no knowledge of what happened on the surface. They simply refer to it as the Big Blast, and that the entrances to the pyramids collapsed, burying them below the surface. They also have no timescale for how long subsequent events are placed at, but it's said that during the period of darkness, the strict sense of order among their ancestors was soon lost after the Big Blast. They describe how, having fallen from grace, their ancestors soon struggled for both light and food, and in desperation would turn upon each other. As I've noted previously, no matter the seeming security and order and structure in human societies, it takes a short period without food or water for things to quickly deteriorate into a brutal survival of the fittest, especially in extreme conditions such as these. So seemingly the Imperials were quickly brought to desperation by their situation, or perhaps disagreements, and fought among themselves. Their descendants describe these struggles over what is said to be artifacts of magical power that could produce food from the air and light, which burned for a lifetime. They refer to this period as the Tribe War, and it's said that from this initial conflict, several tribes split off and went deeper into the tunnels to find areas to inhabit for themselves. Time passes by, and the tribes have grown across generations, and with each generation, they spread their camps further into the dark corridors of the pyramid complexes. This leads to what is called the Backstab War, where the limited space and territory available to the ancestors caused them to fight over the best areas adjacent to their tribal camps. Then came what is titled as the Wrecker War. This is the most strange turn of events, and none can truly know just how or why it came to pass. It's said that a new tribe appears, known as the Wreckers, who are said to have ventured further and deeper into the darkest tunnels. They talk of strange horrors preying on the tribes and stalking tunnels. Things continued to worsen, and it's said the tribes entered into a nightmarish time where their finest warriors were mercilessly slaughtered in the darkness. Evil monsters from the depths roamed the corridors now, and the death and mutilations reached a horrific scale. Camps were destroyed, many lives lost. But then, the so-called Wreckers returned from the dark depths, but not to be their saviours, for they brought with them only more of these monstrous horrors, and somehow had aligned themselves with these beings. It's unknown just how this was possible, but it's said that the Wreckers and their allies deluged through the tunnels like a ravaging swarm. Their ultimatum to the tribes was simple: surrender or be destroyed. Some tribes attempted to fight back, but no record of them remains past this time. Many other tribes would submit to the Wreckers, but it's told how these Wreckers then further split the tribes by taking positions of leadership within their communities. It's said that all tribes now existed in a state of fear of one another, a tension that is said to exist to this day, for none would seek to impose another intertribal war, knowing the horror that could be unleashed upon one another should this occur. This relationship, seemingly between the Necron and the Wreckers, is an extremely bizarre one, and something that has not been since explained in any way, shape or form. It remains entirely open to speculation just what it all means. The descendants of these tribes, though, now talk about the so-called Big Dig. The tribes continued to remain in the depths of the pyramids for further generations, and now the Wreckers were running things. Other areas that were previously inaccessible became open to the tribes, and this enabled them to discover in time what they believed were the collapsed entrances to the surface lost generations previous. This discovery prompted the so-called Big Dig, where tribes sent their strongest warriors and presumably excavators to remove the collapsed debris around the entrances, with the goal of the tribes once again reaching the surface and the light. Many would die through the harsh nature of the work, not to mention rockfalls and roof collapses. Oceans of sand would sometimes pour in, burying workers alive in suffocating deluges. The tribes, though, had their set goal in mind, and it was such a huge project work continued for many years. After some time, though, many of the workers began to report strange sounds from above, grunts, roars, and other bizarre sounds. The tribes became fearful of what awaited them, what was out there still. They continued on more tentatively until one day an exit from the tombs was created. A huge collapse brought light beaming in, and more with it. As deafening sounds echoed into the chambers, the tribes saw once again the light of the surface. But as they gathered around their exit, they saw in horror and amazement huge stonking shapes moving around. They were massive, and they were green. Huge jaws packed with teeth, gigantic bulging muscles. The tribes cowered in fear, but the Wreckers stepped forward with courage. These green-skinned hulks now looked upon the tribespeople with what seemed like confusion. As more of the tribal humans stumbled out onto the slopes of the vast deserts before them, their initial fear soon turned to awe, as they saw hundreds of these green beasts stomping up and down the dunes, digging and moving rocks with huge mechanical claws. The air was filled with the sounds of excavation, rocks being split, detonations, sand removal, big machines roaring as they worked. And still further in the distance, there was an area of plateau where the green things were seemingly racing around on powerful vehicles, and others were arguing or even just fighting among themselves, some randomly firing weapons. The wreckers looked to their own drab, ragged clothes, and then looked at the bright, exciting colours and styles of the beasts, and were amazed and excited by such visions of creativity. They were braver still, and ventured out as they stood in amazement at the spectacle of these big green beasts, who shoved them aside and stared back, but showed them little other interest. Eventually, a huge green beast they would later know as a mech strode up to them. He towered over the wrecker tribespeople and looked upon them with his big red eyes, and then, snarling, uttered a single word: "Diggers." From the perspective of the human tribes who had until now been surviving through crude, blunt tools and really only scratching out bare minimal survival in the darkness, the brightness of the surface was only made brighter and more invigorating by the exciting colours and activity of what they would soon overhear and learn were calling themselves the ORKS. The ORKS paid little attention to these scrawny oomies at first, for as violent as orcs are, they're not focused like the Imperium or Tyranids on scouring all that are not like them from the galaxy. However, human worlds, once they've been crushed by an orc warg, will not be exterminated necessarily, but usually the humans are enslaved by the orcs, fulfilling whatever work orders they need, or perhaps just for amusement. Fighting each other, for example. Fighting squigs, fighting grots, fighting snots, fighting whatever basically. The point is, the orcs didn't immediately slaughter the tribes from the depths of the pyramids, but they were fine with near to immediately enslaving them, under penalty of having their heads bashed in. The orcs supervising heard these oomy diggers speaking about buried tech in the tunnels, and took any of this they could get hold of to sell to their mechs. The diggers, who had been initially awed by the orcs, were unsurprisingly enjoying less being subjugated by them, but what could they do? Orcs were bigger and brutal in fighting. The fate of the diggers seemed unfortunately sealed. They had thought that the surface would bring them freedom, instead it brought them the opposite. Soon though, on one fabled night as told by the descendants of the tribes now happy to title themselves as diggers, it is said that from the depths of the tunnel came the allies of the wreckers, and those orcs in and around the tunnels of the pyramids were quickly slaughtered. The few who ran off into the darkness of the night lived to tell other orcs, but all that could be seen in the light of day were no bodies, but ruined machines, broken weapons, scorched ground, and a lot of black dust. The fleeing orcs were soon found, scattered into the desert out of their minds, picked up by other orcs on scavenging wagons, rambling about gleaming eyes in the darkness, and that the pyramids had glowed with power before portals spilled out an army of terror, that their weapons were blazing light, and other orcs were dragged off to the depths of the pyramids. The orcs would never return to this area. They left it for the diggers, giving it the appropriate name of Morgarg Durlurk Gulskar Dreg Snick Slag, or for the Umis, the fortress of ancient terrifying power, land of waiting death, pain and destruction. Strangely, the orcs seemed not to hold this incident against the diggers, and so in time when the diggers approached the orc shanty towns, they were seemingly appearing in steadily increasing size. They found they were able to also trade the technology salvaged from the pyramids with the orc mechs, and for their trouble they gained shooters of their own. Orc mech demand for the tech from the pyramids grew, and so developed a roaring trade, where the diggers' own experts began scouring for old weapons and seeking tech from the depths of the pyramids. Moreover, as the diggers began to learn about orc technology, it enabled them to think more about their own clubs and jewelry that they themselves had held for so long. They began to discover that the things they had collected over the years were more than they seemed to be. Some of their strange weapons were not in fact clubbing tools, but shooters themselves. Some of their bangles and other jewelry, when manipulated correctly, could seem to produce energy shields. Trading with the orcs for the diggers meant more than just some rough shooters and goods. It actually brought to them a gift of knowledge, and now they are able to think far more about the tech they have and just what it means. The orcs' fear of the diggers' pyramids would ease, but they would rarely, if ever, dare to return to the pyramid plateau itself. The orcs on Angelus have come to view the diggers as an amusing tribe who they tolerate mainly out of necessity, for without the diggers they couldn't access the treasures of the pyramids, and bizarrely the diggers themselves continue to be excited by the bright and noisy activities of the orcs and seek to emulate and even integrate themselves further with the orcs. The diggers, now in the modern era of M41, are led by these so-called wreckers, and bizarrely over the generations they now seek to fully emulate the orcs, even going so far as to try and make themselves look more orky. They wear outfits to bulk up their appearance, they create claws and artificial fanged jaws, they decorate their armour and vehicles in orky colours and designs, and strangest of all, they will even go so far as to paint themselves green, wanting to make themselves literally into a pseudo-orc society. This is of course much to the amusement and entertainment of orcs, who find this new digger mob all the more hilarious. It should be noted again that orcs being amused or even mildly respecting of humans is not without precedent, the most notable of course being Commissar Yarok, who orcs have often regarded as being orc-like, not least because he decapitated an orc war boss, much to the fear of the nearby orcs who bowed to a superior fighter. But the myth of Yarok among the orc was a curious one. For those who had heard of this legendary Umi boss, were always surprised by how small in reality he was, much to their disappointment. So, similarly to this, the orcs have come to regard the diggers something like honorary orcs, in the crudest framing of that concept. The diggers continue to adapt their tech to their needs and wear as much shiny things as possible, adorning themselves and their vehicles with bones, crystals, and whatever they think looks impressive. They sometimes expand their looting parties to search for scrap around the deserts that they have learned came from the Hulk. They'll also fight territorial battles with other digger mobs, as each tribal mob seeks the best scrap to take to the orcs' big town that became known as Mech Town. They also fight against what are known as the Grot Rebels or the Gretchen Revolutionaries. Again, this is to emulate their orc neighbours, for the diggers still crave to be immersed in orc culture, even going so far as to take on terms from orc mobs for their own. For example, the youngest scavenger fighters in a digger mob will be known as youths. The older diggers are known as digger boys, and then you have digger shamans, who are said to be attuned to the environment and excellent at scouting tech. They also seem to be able to subconsciously predict things around them, as if they can see the future, and apparently performing rituals enables them to do this even stronger and with more accuracy. But just what these digger shamans are though, who knows? And of course you have the digger knobs. Just like orc knobs, these are bigger and more adventurous members in a digger mob, and they'll have stronger leadership and confidence, as well as having a reputation for cracking skulls. Just like the orcs, it seems the way your standard digger becomes a knob is by some good fighting. So this is something a digger knob is always watching for among his mob. To the orcs, the diggers are a necessary part of their lives on the planet now. They're an amusement to some, an annoyance to others. And some mechs resent having to rely on scrawny Umis for finding the best tech, not to mention having to trade for it and not just take it off of them. For orcs, an Umi will never be a proper orc, and they don't take them seriously. So for this reason, a mech will rarely give the diggers any proper orc tech. Although the orcs control their mech town and the huge scar across the planet near to the town known as the Skid, the planet itself is far bigger than this one small area, and out there the orcs hold far less control. For there is another faction who've emerged on the world of Angelus, who fight against both the orcs and the diggers. And no, it's not the Grots. Out in the wastes are built various forts, and it's from here the orcs' most bitter rivals fight them across the barren wastes of Angelus. Or as it's known to the orcs, Gorka Morka. The so-called Muties harbour a bitter resentment toward the orcs, for the Muties hold some records going back into the history of Angelus and just how they came to find themselves in this bleak and harsh landscape. The Muties know that originally they came from a highly advanced race, so advanced they had mastered the skies and the stars. It's said that their ancestors travelled out among the stars aboard a huge ship, and their ancestors are said to have not been like the Muties are now. No, they had smooth bodies, and they were very content with this. Though came the day when their world was ruined. Their ancestors were thrown to the surface of the planet, and it's said this was the fault of the Greenskins. Their Hulk ripped their ancestors' sky ship down from its place among the stars, and it's said that the Ork Hulk smashed into the planet in the region they now call the Skid. But the Muties' ancestors' vessel crashed down also into the deep desert, much destroyed by its heavy impact, but a large section remained intact, including some survivors of the ship. These ancestral survivors now had to contend with a world racked by dust storms, burning hot days, freezing nights, and soon also they discovered toxic gas and radiation spewing and contaminating the atmosphere from the Hulk far away. The survivors seemingly had no way to contact others who travelled among those stars, and so they were stranded, and with each generation changes in them began to appear. It is said the poisonous atmosphere caused by the Ork's Hulk is the cause of this, and so many of the survivors were becoming forms that they now termed Muties. Many would die though from these aberrations, and some of their bodies became simply too weak, others their bones became twisted, some found other distortions in limbs, eyes. The strongest though would survive through each generation, and soon the smooth-skinned survivors were long forgotten. But those who were left had to contend with the realization that they would never again take that form they had once been so long ago, and this brought much bitterness and anger among the Muties towards the Orks. Unlike the Diggers, however, the Society of Survivors did not turn in on themselves in tribalistic infighting. The survivors instead passed on their knowledge, their people's story and their quest for the future generations, for they still hope one day that those among the stars will be their salvation. Over the years, the Muties have been able to restore power and capability to some sections of what now forms their town of sorts. Dwelling perhaps is a better description. Some came to call it the Vigila, after they discovered some letter forms learned through generations upon a section of their realm, and this was adopted as the title for their domain. Centuries of work scavenging and most importantly passing of information has enabled the Muties to restore much power and other systems. One of their greatest discoveries was upon unlocking access to data terminals, gifting them significant stores of information, although much of it was confusing and beyond their understanding. Blackouts and short circuits unfortunately occur often, but the Muties repair what they can. Above all though, the retention of information, of knowledge, has been long taught as the most important trait of all for the Muties society. Those dedicated to this task are known as the Keepers. Whenever new information is found, it is the Keepers' role to record this in their litanies and lore passed on to Keepers' apprentices, along with many scrolls of wisdom. The Keepers continue to hold the history of the Muties alive, their secrets and the memories of their ancestors, who held the hope that one day they might all be saved from this horror. Another aspect of Mutie life is another tenet passed down by their ancestors, the so-called quest, and that is the quest for knowledge. The Muties put faith in their knowledge and will do all possible to prevent its loss. So the Muties now comb through the wastelands seeking for ancient technology from either the Ork Hulk or from fragments of Vigila. It is said that their ancestors tell their forebears maintained camps and bunkers somewhere in this landscape, and they also hunt for this to this day, believing that if found they will contain hordes of valuable tech and knowledge. If any such locations are found, the Keepers absorb the information, iterate it to their apprentices, and then it is handed on to the rulers of the Muties society, for they are responsible for running and updating the files inside of the vast memory databanks of the Vigila. These rulers are known as the Cognoscenti. The Cognoscenti are those who command the society of Muties, the Keepers and the Seekers. They maintain a structured society through their dictation of ritual chants and at all costs maintain the grand quest. Another important part of life for the Muties and their leadership is the deity they worship known as Magod. This powerful being is said to rule the stars themselves, and that everything which comes to pass is at the behest of Magod. Unsurprisingly, the Muties believe that it is their deity's will that the Orks will be exterminated from the planet, and also that their temple to Magod is the Vigila itself. The most holy of these places is at the pinnacle of the ancient ship, where they have founded a temple, and it is said that here are contained some of the most mystifying technological marvels that even the cognoscenti cannot fathom. Legend tells that one day this temple may be used to communicate directly with Magod, but this has not come to pass yet, as none have been found worthy of this honour. Their legends tell, though, through what they call their Ashtrath prophecy by great Magos Gorvaz, there will come a time where a Mutie who is sufficiently enlightened will be able to use the temple to request aid from Magod against the orcs, the diggers, and the other creatures inhabiting their world. Not only will their enemies be vanquished, but the Muties themselves will be physically restored to their original forms, and together they will ascend to the stars to rejoice and embrace Magod. They believe this to their core and patiently await the day it will come to pass. The Muties' grand quest is, of course, to recover any and all knowledge from the dangerous wastelands, and this is the task entrusted to the Seekers, the bravest and finest warriors of the Muties. Sometimes this brings them into conflict with other pockets and villages of Muties who have never heard of Aether Vigila and its grand quest. They've long since lost all knowledge of from whence they came, but they may have hoarded tech that they are now grossly ignorant of its purpose or value. The Seekers also continue the so-called War of Retribution against the Orcs and punish them at any opportunity. Only those with iron will and powerful resolve can survive against the passive, harsh environment of the wastes and the active aggression of the Orc menace. For those Seekers who gain enough renown from partaking in the quest, then they may one day be elevated to the ranks of cognoscenti and then initiated into learning some of the most secret rites and knowledge of their ancestors, as well as carrying forward the rule over the quest and the occupants of the Aether Vigila. The cognoscenti have maintained a considerable amount of knowledge spread across millennia by teaching via the keepers and their apprentice rites of construction, litanies of energy, and paradigms of maintenance. If it were not, of course, wildly clear, the Society of Muties descends from the Mechanicus, and thus they have a strong focus on retention of knowledge and passing this down through word of mouth if necessary, which it is believed the Mechanicus themselves do with specific tech. The databanks of the Aether Vigila are of course their vault of knowledge, but they still believe in passing it down through generations as a backup for this. They also use scrolls, including original scrolls that it is said are transparent, while others are glowing slabs which flow with text. In the modern time for the Muties, they've resorted to handwritten script once again. One core difference, though, between their Mechanicus origins and the cognoscenti is that the Mechanicus of course believe in the cult of the machine and worship technology. The cognoscenti have fractured off from this belief. In fact, they consider that one of the reasons their situation came to pass was because their ancestors diverged from the path set by Magod, and that in their quest for mastering machine over the organic, in doing so denying their own true existence, offended Magod. It's reasonable to assume this belief came about from the fact that unlike the Mechanicus, the Muties lacked the knowledge to continue the physical adaptation so important for the Mechanicus, as well of course the actual knowledge itself. So now the Muties believe they must not repeat these errors of the past, and instead they restrict technology to weapons and their maintenance of the Aether Vigila. Unlike the Orcs, the Muties do not ride around in machine wagons, they ride atop beasts of various form, and indeed the Muties use beasts of all variety for different tasks from energy to general labour. Where these beasts originated from is anybody's guess. It may have been from the Hulk or perhaps the Aether Vigila itself, and these creatures will also be farmed for their food as well as clothing and hundreds of other uses. The technology held by the Muties, it's fair to say, for the most part surpasses that of the Orcs. Their ancient knowledge allows Muties to wield weapons of light, heat and plasma, whereas Orcs tend to use far more crude projectile weapons. These weapons, though, were only assigned by the cognoscenti, such is their revered value among Mutie society. As every year passes, Muties continue in holding their devout faith in Magod that soon, via their righteous quest, salvation will come and vengeance upon the Orc menace and diggers will finally be dealt out, extinguishing them. Then the Muties believe they will finally be returned to the stars and become once again their true selves. The tale of planet XCV-103, first designated Angelus and later known to its growing orc population as Gorkamorka, is a fascinating one. We will of course come to the orcs themselves, but I deliberately avoided delving into the more ORKY things first, as for me what I greatly enjoy is the unfolding events here as witnessed by the human Imperials who arrived simply to carry out a surveying mission. How could they have known such a routine operation would soon leave them stranded upon a barren planet on the rim of the galaxy, left to fend for themselves for the next 5 millennia. For some, this quickly deteriorated into anarchy and would form bizarre quasi-orc society where they struggled to survive with the scraps of the world whilst integrating themselves bizarrely into orc society. But others, as we see, have formed a distorted Mechanicus cult who have sadly become ruined by the toxic pollution brought upon by the Space Hulk and now quite tragically believe they will be one day reunited with their deity and others like them among the stars. In the modern era of M41, it's recorded that an Ordo Xenos kill team were deployed to Angelus only to disappear, which honesty seems surprising. Later, we see Ultramarines appearing at some point perhaps to investigate this lost kill team, although the Ultras appear to have from description been more focused upon engagements with the Necron, which is also curious. It's a bizarre unknown as to why there is no record of the Diggers attempting to make contact with the modern Imperials when they arrived, although on reflection, it's perhaps as well they did not, for the most likely scenario would be for them to either be simply executed as Xenos collaborating heretics. The only survivors who may have had some glimmer of hope may be the Muties, and I say some because, again, in all likelihood, they would just be killed as abhorrent mutations. The Imperium is not especially open-minded in this regard, however, one might imagine a situation where they could be spared, because if they were the only ones who were keeping some faint flame alive for the Imperium out of this entire incident, even if their true origins have become lost among the foggy mythical storytelling, perhaps were the right Imperial investigator to happen upon them with a curious mind, the right Mechanicus Archaeo team find their specific circumstances interesting enough for study, then it's possible, I think, that they may give them some leniency. For myself, out of all of this, the far more bizarre and disturbing aspect remains completely unexplained, which is just why would the Necrons ever collaborate with humans, and what did the Wreckers arrange with them generations previously in the dark depths of the tomb complexes upon the planet of Angelus? Oh, and lastly, if you were unsure, in part 2 we will be exploring the ORKY side of things.